Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video, we'll be taking a look at the new allied races and how good are they if you were to change your Death Knight in patch 8.3 to one of the new upcoming allied races. In patch 8.3, Death Knights will have access to every new allied races that was added since Legion to now. And today we'll take a look at which racials might fit Death Knight the best. We will be excluding these from Volpera as well as Mechanome since they are not fully finished. I will talk about them just a little bit at the end of the video, but we'll mostly focus on the allied races that are currently available. But we cannot really test out these racials on a Death Knight on PTR just yet. They are technically customizable but not creatable, so we'll have to wait and see for that until later. But I am gonna hop on my warrior that I did change to every allied race as available right now, in order to give you guys a little bit of an example how those racials will work for another strength class and how will they be applicable for a Death Knight. Alrighty, take a look at the Void Elf racials. How would they be good for a Death Knight? First racial is going to be Spatial Rift, rip open a hole in time, transporting to the target location. This is actually pretty good for Death Knights. Death Knights are pretty wheelchair, they don't really have a lot of mobility, so having Spatial Rift, in PvP in particular, could be quite good. In PvE, it could give you a little bit of opportunity to maybe, let's say you know there's mobility happening, you're going to go and attack an enemy, you're going to fight him, go through your burst rotation, swing around this side, send the Spatial Rift going that way, and then continue doing damage. Then with very minimal mobility, you might be able to teleport to another location. This will also be pretty good for Blood Death Knights when it comes to kiting enemies. Sometimes Blood Death Knights cannot really get away from enemies quite as efficiently, so in a sense, this could be good depending on the situation. Definitely a positive when it comes to trying out Death Knight Void Elves. Chill of the Night reduces shadow damage by 1%. This one isn't gonna play into playstyles that much, although with the new N'Zoth raid, I'm pretty sure there'll be quite a bit of shadow damage everywhere. Entropic Embrace, your abilities have a chance to empower you with the Essence of the Void, causing your damage and healing effects to deal additional 5% as Shadow Frost for 12 seconds. 5% extra damage, basically on top of everything you're doing, is actually quite big. And we're gonna do the damage here as a arms warrior to show you more or less what it's gonna look like for Frost and Unholy. For Frost and Unholy, they're really all about doing the most amount of burst during a very short opener, and it is gonna really benefit Frost and Unholy, and this is why we are an arms warrior. With arms, you can get yourself quite a big charge, go for a big setup, you got extra Shadow Frost damage, and you are just gonna try to load as much burst into the enemy at the very beginning, like I am doing right now, where I'm spending my rage in order to increase the amount of damage that I'll be doing in just a moment here. And as I'm attacking the enemy, I'll go with a big old Blade Storm. The 5% extra damage is gonna be quite valuable, especially for Frost and Unholy, because this is where most of your damage happens from. So for Death Knights, this is actually quite a pretty big increase. It's very similar to how for Sub-Rogues, Entropic Embrace ends up being quite big for your damage because you're doing the most amount of damage in the opener. So for Death Knights, this will be actually quite a nice buff in general. It's also Shadow and it's also Frost, so it could maybe have some benefits from Mastery, but most of the Mastery effects are locked down to Death Knight abilities, not racials. Ethereal Connection allows you to have Void storage and transmogrification cost reduced by 50. I mean, if you are going to play in a Void Elf Death Knight, pretty sure you're going to go for some spicy looking mogs. So mogging is going to be a little bit nice, and Pre-Natural Calm has actually no use for you at all. You don't cast a single spell as a Death Knight unless maybe you use some of the essences with a channel like the Laser Beam. But Void Elves are actually, I would say, just a step ahead, mostly because they deal with the immobility that is Death Knight, but also that 5% extra damage for your burst is going to be quite nice. Now, if you were to make your Death Knight a Nightborne, what abilities and passive racials would you end up getting for yourself? The first one is going to be cantrips. This one is not going to change your playstyle at all, but it is nice to have a mailbox for you. I quite appreciate having this on my rogue. There's been a number of occasions where I was able to go to a mailbox to retrieve 3,000 extra free gold, but usually I use it when it comes to raid nights. If you're someone who's always forgetful to pick up your mats from raid or maybe potions, then cantrips is going to be quite value. Then you have Ancient History, inscription skill increased by 15. Then you have Arcane Resistance, reduces arcane damage taken by 1%. Not huge value so far. Your main racial ability is Arcane Pulse. Deals a bit of arcane damage. I'm not going to say 5,000 because damage is going to be a little bit different for everybody. But deals a bit of arcane damage to nearby enemies and reduces movement speed by 50%. Death Knights already have quite a bit of movement reduction when it comes to using your racial. For example, both Unholy and Blood have a Death and Decay talent, where Death and Decay will reduce enemy speed by 90%, and every second after it's gonna pull back on that slow reduction. But having a automatic AoE slow, I think isn't necessary for Death Knight. The extra arcane damage that it does from the ability, I guess is nice in some AoE situations, but I've never found it to be super amazing on my rogue. Although this can be nice, instead of having to spam Chains of Ice in PvP on an enemy if they're up in melee, using this racial in order to not consume one of your runes would be, I guess, somewhat decent. Where I think you'd get some value out of Death Knight is Magical Affinity. Increases magic damage dealt by 1%. Now this isn't huge. This isn't enough to make anybody want to play Nightborne Assassination Rogue for all that nature damage. But any magical damage that means Arcane, Frost, Fire, Shadow, Holy, Nature, anything that is a magical attack is going to be 1% stronger. So for Frost Death Knights with your big breath playstyle, everything doing 1% extra damage is technically going to feed into your burst and damage. For Unholy, it's not quite as good because a portion of Unholy damage is Shadow, and in Mythic Plus is where you can get all your dots and diseases on everybody. That is going to be quite where the value comes from, but a majority of your damage, a good portion of it, comes from auto attacks from you as well as your pets, so you're not getting the full value. When it comes to the Blood Death Knight, you are going to get just a little bit extra damage. The slow for Blood DKs could be quite slow in order to kite enemies, but in terms of that, I think the beneficial for playing as a Nightborne, as a Death Knight, the slow is going to be quite nice. The mailbox, but most likely that extra magic damage. And Frost DK ends up taking the most advantage of that racial. When it comes to Lightforged Janai, you get yourself, first of all, a really weird combo because, you know, they're all light infused and light forged, and them being a Death Knight, so you have these like light abilities and Death Knight abilities. I guess it's unique. To me, it's a little weird. But take a look at the racials. You get yourself Forge of Light. So every 15 minutes you can summon a Forge if you ever need blacksmithing on the go, but also increase your blacksmithing by 10. So if you're someone who's in professions, it's not insanely good. It's gonna have you spend less on blacksmithing to get some raid pieces from crafting. Your first ability, that's your one and only ability for Lightforged, it's Light's Judgment. 40 or rage 2.5 minute cooldown, call down a strike of holy energy, dealing 36,000 holy damage to enemies within 5 yards after 3 seconds. This ability is actually quite good. In terms of raw AoE damage, it does quite a number. So for when it comes to playing Death Knights, one of the advantages you have as Frost and Unholy is the fact that you can do quite a bit of AoE. So one of the advantages when it comes to playing Frost and Unholy is the fact that you can do quite a bit of AoE damage. When it comes to Blood, I guess it's going to do some damage extra. It isn't a bad ability for the damage that it offers. It does have a little bit of a charge up to it, but the damage you can put out in AoE like a Mythic Plus, the opener in your raids is going to have this racial as part of your rotation is also quite nice too. Again, not going to be a game changer, but it's not terrible either. Some of the other passives your racial brings: Demon's Bane, experience gained from killing demons increased by 20 if you ever decide to level a Death Knight and you go to all the Legion zones. You also have Light's Reckoning. Erupt with light upon death, it deals a bit of holy damage to enemies within 8 yards and heals allies for 27,000. As Death Knights, you're going to be pretty slow, so if you end up being that Death Knight that gets caught in a lot of AoEs and you can never get out of them fast enough, then Light's Reckoning will at least provide a heal for your allies and a little bit damage for enemies, but again, not super insane. Their unused racial though is really quite good if you can use it. I wouldn't say that Lightforged are ahead of anybody when it comes to racials. In PvP, I think they're just about the same as most racials in the game. They're not really ahead, but not really super behind either. But the AoE damage you can put out with Light's Judgment could be quite significant. But then we also have the Highmountain Tauren. These guys are... it's a mixed bag when it comes to Death Knights. Let me take a look at their racials real quick. The first one is going to be Bull Rush. This is your active ability, 2-minute cooldown. It's very similar to the Tauren racial where you'll stomp around you and knock people down. But here you will charge at somebody to knock them down. So it's a linear ability rather than AoE around you. Charge forward for 1 second, knocking enemies down for 1.5 seconds. It's quite a decent bit of extra CC if you are lacking on stuns. This also can be used to move. So as Death Knights are pretty wheelchair, they're kind of slow as a class in general. Having a bit of a short charge might help you cross a short distance. So this racial, even while it might not really be used to stun somebody down, never really does damage, so you won't really ever use it offensively. To use it as mobility, as an ability, for Death Knights could be quite huge just to keep up on an enemy. So this is something that is worth considering. You also get the Mountaineer passive, increases your versatility by 1%. Versatility can be used by all 3 specs of Death Knight. For Blood Death Knights, it's a little bit extra survivability, a little bit extra healing. For Frost, that's more damage from your Frost abilities and melee abilities. And for Unholy, this is damage increase for your pets, your damage, and your shadow damage, which is quite good overall. But versatility isn't an amazing stat for Death Knights, so this stat on its own is not super insane. You also have Pride of the Iron Horn, allows you to mine a little bit faster and increase your mining skill. Rugged Tenacity reduces damage taken by 99, so every attack that hits you has a little bit of its damage shaved off. Would be quite valuable for a Blood Death Knight, because just every hit that hits you just does slightly less damage. It isn't going to be enough to have you survive a fight unless you're just getting hit by a specific attack that deals only 99.99% of your health, but just that one sliver with Rugged Tenacity saves your life. But I guess just having some sort of value for tanking this feature is nice. I guess also goes same for Frost and Unholy when it comes to PvP, but not super game changing. Waste Not, Want Not is another racial that won't really affect your gameplay. You have a chance to loot additional meat and fish from enemies in case you want to farm mats. If you were to play a Dark Iron Dwarf Death Knight, the racial choices you would have, first of all, would be your main racial. Fireblood, 2-minute cooldown, instant, removes all poison, disease, curse, magic, and bleed effects, and increases your strength by 600, and an additional 200 for each effect removed, lasts 8 seconds. This effect shares a 30-second cooldown with other similar effects, so things like trinkets and PvP. This racial is not terrible, but it's not amazing for Death Knights because of its short duration. The amount of strength you can get with this ability in dungeons and raids can increase and is at least 600, which is huge. That's a lot of strength. If you can even somehow find your way into a bunch of debuffs and remove them from yourself, this could be quite big and might even be pretty decent for Blood Death Knights in some dungeons, some raids where you have a debuff and you just want to be able to remove it off of you without a healer really being in need. So you will have some advantage over the normal dwarves who only have a defensive buff. So you would have a little bit of strength, which can be used defensively and offensively. For Unholy and Frost, however, the 8-second duration is simply not good enough. I'm on my Arms Warrior and he's a pretty good representation because this class is kind of bursty, but it takes a little bit to build up the damage. I'm going to get a charge, I'm going to get my Lucid Dream rolling, so I'm full of rage. I'm going to drop a Warbreaker on an enemy and then use as many rage-based abilities. And this is where I'm doing the most amount of damage, but my damage continues on after my Warbreaker. I'll get a buff for strength, and I'll use that buff with Blaze Storm, and then I'll continue doing more and more and more damage to enemies. So Fireblood is going to have to find a place in between of that damage. I'm kind of doing consistently good rampy damage at all times. There's no really peak point. And for Frost, Death Knight, and Unholy, like how would you be able to, let's say you charge in? This is similar to me starting my setup here and getting my, let's say, Breath rolling as Frost, or building up the Army of the Dead and really unleashing all of them as Unholy and building up a strength buff over time. The time where you can find a moment where you can get that 8 seconds worth of a strength buff is just not going to be quite a value for most Death Knights in general. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not amazing. The problem is just the short duration. There's other buffs that are going to be a little bit stronger that give you a little bit more value, and we'll talk about them in a second. But the 6 seconds on damage alone is not amazing. In PvP, however, this is quite good. If you have rogues or pharaohs attacking you, this could be a good defensive just to shake off all of those negative effects and get you maybe out of certain bad situations. For tanks, this could be decent, but with a short duration, I would not recommend it for Frost and Unholy Death Knights, unless you simply like the look of these guys. Then you have some of the other passives called Dungeon Delver. While indoors, move 4% faster. You would think this one wouldn't be super amazing, but when it comes to you playing a Death Knight who are generally pretty slow, moving a little bit faster inside of a dungeon or a raid can help you get out of bad situations like fire on the ground or just simply running from enemy to enemy as the tank moves the boss from one side of the room to the other. Forged in Flames reduces damage taken from physical attacks by 1%, is incredible for Blood Death Knights. You're always taking heavy physical hits to your face. Only sometimes do you take magical hits, as most enemies in dungeons and raids are going to be wailing on you in one way or another. So Forged in Flames, it's not amazing because it's only 1% reduction, which is not huge, but if any reduction, you always get benefits of this ability at all times. So I'd say it's pretty decent if you're a tank. Mass production increases blacksmithing skill by 5 and blacksmithing speed by 25. If you ever need something to craft in a jiffy, I guess it's a decent choice. Then you have Mole Machine, and I just got to test out what this looks like. I actually never messed with this ability, but it's basically like a Hearthstone that will take you to Ironforge or Stormwind, or it'll take you back to the Dark Iron starting area. So if your Hearthstone is down, this could be a decent travel option in general. And then you have the Maga Orcs as Death Knights. Let's take a look at their racials. You have first, and your biggest racial is Ancestral Call, 2-minute cooldown, and it's a little bit different than your normal Orc racial that increases your attack power. This one allows you to invoke the spirits of your ancestors, grant you a random secondary stat for 15 seconds. So it can be anything from haste, crit, mastery, or versatility. So if I use it here, I gain mastery. Imagine 15 seconds of mastery with Frost Decay, Breath, or if you get crit or haste as Unholy with your army. This buff lasts 15 seconds. It's not a crazy increase in terms of the damage output, but with Death Knights pouring all of their damage during the opener, with how long this buff lasts, with Death Knights being very rampy, you have the opposite effect of Dark Iron Dwarves, where this is actually quite a good buff. Even if you don't get the best stat you need, like being Frost Death Knight and getting haste buff, it's not amazing, but it'll slightly give you more auto attacks, and overall it'll increase your damage output, since secondary stats are generally right now in BFA stronger than primary stats like agility, strength, or intellect. So this, at 15 seconds, if you get that great roll as Frost Death Knight, if you just get mastery, versatility, or crit, you got a golden buff. If you're on Holy Death Knight and you get haste, crit, or versatility, you got a good buff. Even Blood Death Knights could get a decent buff that they might find a use for. The passives are Open Skies, increases mount speed by 10%. Death Knights already have a passive for being a Death Knight to move faster on a mount. Pretty sure these two buffs won't stack, otherwise you'll be the fastest Death Knight in the West. Savage Blood reduces duration of poisons, diseases, and curses by 10%. Not incredibly useful, even as a tank, you won't really have too many uses where just 10% less duration on a poison is enough for you to survive, usually not really. So, not super amazing, but could be quite decent in PvP. Sympathetic Vigor is going to make your unholy pets a little bit stronger. That's about it. Not a lot of enemies in dungeons and raids focus your pets either. None of them can have any tank properties. They're really just there to wail on damage and are mostly ignored by enemies and mechanics. So in PvP, maybe if a rogue focuses your pet to kill it, it will live a little bit longer, but I don't think this is going to stop anybody from obliterating your pet, even if they try to. I would say the Maga racial on use is actually quite good. The passives though are just not super amazing. If you decide to play a cool Tiran as a Death Knight, you have actually quite a good amount of racials, particularly if you want to play Blood. Let's take a look at the cool Tiran racials. First one is going to be Haymaker, which is your main racial. It's a 6-yard range, 2.5 minute cooldown, 1 second to cast it. Wind up, then unleash the might upon your foe, dealing 9,100 physical damage, stunning for 3 seconds, and knocking the enemy back. Now, there's literally nothing here that I can knock back that isn't gonna instantly die. Like this squirrel, if I try to send it flying, it's just gonna explode on itself. But this ability for a Blood Death Knight could be quite good. I guess you could use it as a Frost Death Knight or Unholy, but most of the times you struggle to get to the enemy, so you don't want to really push him away from you. Unless you want to play yo-yo with the enemy, just knock him back and yoink him back with a Death Grip, just for fun. I guess that could be cool. For Blood Death Knight, however, in Mythic Plus dungeons, for example, sometimes you'll be able to knock an enemy back that you need away from you. Blood Death Knights have a trouble with mobility, so at least getting an enemy a little bit of distance away from you could sometimes be good, although it only works on one enemy. That stun could also be okay too, if you don't spec for a stun. Some of the passives are going to be Brush It Off, increases versatility by 1%. When you take damage, heal for 2% of that amount over 4 seconds. This is incredible for Blood Death Knight, mostly because of the way that they heal. Blood Death Knights you would think are, metal plated, ironclad, really tanky, but in reality, their health just kind of yo-yos around. It just ping-pongs back and forth. You go from very low health to really high health. That's because of the way that they're constructed. They're designed to be a self-healer tank. They're supposed to take huge amounts of damage for their health pool, but then they're supposed to be able to heal over that damage, to prepare for the next hit, and then be able to siphon the enemy's life force to heal themselves and sustain. So, for Blood Death Knights, with just how much raw damage they take, and sometimes in a single hit from bosses and adds, you get quite a big value, because those are big hits that are hitting you. So 2% of a massive hit is actually quite a sizable heal for your Blood Decay, which is good at all times. Versatility also gives you a little bit extra survivability and healing, so if you weren't gonna play tank, this is great. Then we have Child of the Sea, hold your breath for 50% longer and swim 10% faster. Most Death Knights don't deal with this, you can just walk on water, but if you ever need to swim, I guess it's a nice passive. You also have Jack of all trades, which increases all skill professions by 5, and Rime of the Ancient Mariner, reducing frost and nature damage taken by 1%. I would say Tirans are a pretty substantially decent choice for Blood DK. Frost and Holy, not a terrible choice either, but not really too stand out. And then we have the Zandalari DKs, and these guys are an interesting choice overall. You first of all have the Embrace mechanic and different embraces from different Loa. For example, you have Embrace of the Lower, which is an ability that you get every 5 days to walk up to one of the shrines in Zuldazar and choose a Loa to grant you a buff. For example, if I'm a Blood DK, I decided to go with Embrace of Kragwa. When taking damage, it has a chance to grant me extra health and armor, so for Blood Death Knights it'll be pretty good. Then you also have a buff that has a chance to apply bleeds that can stack 3 times, a buff for 4% critical strike for 12 seconds, a buff to do a little shadow damage and heal yourself for the damage done. There's also a buff for movement speed, which could be good, I guess, for Blood Death Knight, just because they're so slow, shows them mobility. And I think I'm missing one more buff, but oh, there's a heal buff too, but that wouldn't really apply to Death Knight nearly as easily. So you actually have quite a variety of these Embraces of Loa that modify, and you can choose which one is needed depending on your spec. You can even just go with a crit buff, which can apply well for all 3 specs and be pretty decent, or maybe the shadow damage, which is the one Samdi buff. So the buffs themselves are going to be the passives, and it's nice to have that versatility, so you are able to choose what buff you need for your class and or spec. I was trying to leap up, but that won't work. But the other racial I want to talk about is Pterodax Swoop. I talked about this one before when it comes to talking about Zandalari, and same thing applies. It just gives you a bit of movement speed while flying. So if you're ever doing world quests or maybe in PvP and you need to get away from an enemy, you could use this to travel. It's a nice little ability to give you a little bit extra movement speed for a short time, 15-minute cooldown. It's nice. I don't really think you'll be able to use it too much in dungeons and raids effectively, but it's not a terrible choice if you need mobility. We also have the actual active ability called Regenerating. 2.5 minute cooldown, regenerate 100% of your maximum health over 6 seconds, interrupted by damage. So as a Blood DK, if you struggle to get away from enemies sometimes, and if they're chasing after you all the time, you might be able to maybe hit them with a slow or something, run away from them, and then hit Regenerating to give yourself a little bit extra health over time. It might help you heal here and there when it comes to dealing with enemies, but I don't think it'll be super amazing. It could be quite useful for Frost and Unholy Death Knights in PvP if you're able to escape your enemies, and with Death Knights having no real self-healing besides death striking, so you need a target to hit, this could be a way for you to disengage from an enemy, catch up a little bit on heals, and then get back in the fight, but again, not super insane. Last racial is going to be City of Gold, increases gold earned from creatures by 2%, which again isn't going to be huge in terms of the combat capabilities. So Zandalari are not a bad choice, but it really does come down to the Loa that you end up choosing. You could just go with the crit buff for Frost and Unholy, and it's not a bad choice. You could go for a tanking buff if you want to be full-blown Blood DK and be a little bit more standard for the healer, or I guess a self-healing tank, which would actually work quite well with the buff. But again, decent buffs that could be used and decent passives that could be used in specific situations. Finally, we have Mechanomes as well as Vulpera, and I'll talk about both of them at the same time because simply both of them are not finished. There's still a lot that Blizzard needs to do and a lot they're working on before we can see what the racials are going to look for them as a final product. In the past, these guys have been pretty busted, and Blizzard has been trying to nerf Mechanomes and trying to buff Vulpera, and they're still not finished, so I cannot say much about these two just yet. I'll make a separate video if it's worth to play Mechanome or Vulpera once they're finished for PTR and basically ready to come out. But taking a look at the Vulpera racials, they are decent. I talked about Vulpera in a video recently. They are alright, but again, completely not finished. There's still more to talk about, so I really cannot tell you if it's good right now or not. Mechanomes are more or less finished, but still lots of tuning needs to be done. Your first racial is going to be Hyper Organic Light Originator Holo. So you'll summon organic light duplicates to attack your foes. This could be quite good if you are a Unholy DK or Frost? Is it simply someone's extra images to fight for you? And they generally do quite a bit of damage. So if you're a Blood DK, this could be quite good for the damage that they do, because they all just auto attack. These are actually going to be quite nice for Unholy with all your different pets that you summon. These guys are extra pets that will last there for quite a bit. And for Frost, this could be quite good with the duration that these guys have, which seems to be about, what, 10-ish seconds or so? So they're going to be there for the bulk of your burst. They are not going to be super amazing in PvP, because they have very little health, so they're not really going to be super, I would say, effective when it comes to the gameplay. But extra damage on top of everything you do is never bad. You also have Skeleton Pinky, which allows you lockpicking of chests and doors that require level of up to 600. Some uses are there, like doing dungeons in the Toldagor as a tank. You won't need a rogue for your group, or not as badly you will need a rogue for your group. Decent ratio, but just a flavor thing. You also have Combat Analysis. Gather and analyze combat data every 5 seconds. Increase your primary stat by 15, stacking up to 8 times. This was heavily nerfed. So it used to give you up to 400 and even maybe 800 strength, but now it's only 150. So this has been severely nerfed to the point where I'm not sure if it's worth considering. Passive 120 strength every time you're fighting an enemy isn't bad, but strength is just, and primary stats in general like agility and intellect are just so low on the totem pole right now compared to secondary stats. For tanks, I guess, and for Frost DK and Unholy, this could be a decent passive as is. You also have Emergency Failsafe, which is great for Blood Death Knights. When you fall below 20% health, heal yourself for 15% of maximum health. This effect can not occur more than once every 2.5 minutes. So this is actually quite amazing for Blood DK, but also can be used for Frost Death Knights as well as Unholy in PvP. Essentially, whenever you drop below a certain amount of health, it will just give you a straight up heal. For Blood DK, sometimes you get super low on health and it can be a little bit hairy. For Unholy and Frost in PvP, for example, same thing. If you just fall below a certain amount of health, it can sometimes give you a heal, unless you just die. Oh, there we go. That's some actual damage. Beautiful. Just have to stand in smoldering flames. Yeah, I get it. It's gonna do some damage. Does the heal work? There it goes. So the heal does work. Recently failed, and now you get yourself a little bit extra healing. It is quite nice. And I feel like for PvP this would be quite good too. For Blood DKs this would be probably the most value. But it's good to know that this racial does actually work. And did it actually give me a heal? It did. Emergency failsafe and gave me 50k with my health out of 300,000 that I have on the PTR servers. Lastly, you have Mastercraft. You function as a personal blacksmithing, anvil, cooking fire, and mining forge. In addition, your limbs include every profession tool. So if you're someone who loves doing professions and you do a lot of them, maybe Mechanomes would be up your alley. Overall though, these guys don't seem to be so far that bad for DPS, decent maybe as a heal tank. But again, Mechanomes are just still a work in progress. I want to say almost they're a decent option for DPS and a tank, but I still can't really say that. I want to wait until Volpera are in a functional state where they're basically ready to release before I really make a finalized decision for how I feel about Volpera as well as Mechanomes. Until then, still to be determined, but I did want to mention that Mechanomes are mostly done and this is where they're at right now. But still, I think it's perfect opportunity for Blizzard to keep them in the oven to cook a little bit more until they're nice and fresh. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts about the different allied races that Death Knights are going to have, and which one do you think is going to be probably some of the best choices, or if you were to make a Death Knight as one of the allied races added in either Legion or BFA, which one would you probably go with that is maybe not Mechanome or Volpera, or maybe just Mechanome and Volpera just for the aesthetics if you guys feel like it. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts about Death Knights and allied races, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.